Have you ever had that experience about how things are much better the way you remember them versus the way things really are? I know when I think about my hometown, I can remember all of the childhood memories and all the way, and it's still in my mind pictured that way. But when I go back home after we've been gone so long, we turn around and find out it's entirely different. Well, all of Israel and Judah had exactly the same situation. After being in exile and captivity for Babylon for 70 years, King Darius had let some of the people come out and go back to Jerusalem. And there their purpose was to go back and rebuild the temple. So as they came into Jerusalem after being gone for almost 70 years, they were expecting it to be just exactly the way they left it. But what they found was complete desolation. What they found was complete destruction. The city was, instead of it being the glorious city that it was literally in ruins. The temple, with all of its glory and with all of its majesty and with all of its beauty, from the stones and the gold and all of the way in which the craftsmen had built that building, not a stone could be found. They couldn't believe their very eyes. It was almost like they were in a town for the very first time. They were going back with the expectations of arriving in a town that they had pictured in their mind. But what they found out was something entirely different. And so they began the task of rebuilding the temple. But after a while, because the work was so great and so demanding, and the conditions were so poor, they abandoned that project. Then came the words of Haggai. Haggai was the first of the post-exile prophets to give a message to the people from God, and it all concerned about rebuilding the house of God, restoring the temple. And so today what I want to do is look at the book of Haggai. So go ahead and get your Bible and turn to it. Now Haggai is a small book, only 2 chapters long. It's the third from the end of the Old Testament. You'll see it sandwiched between Zephaniah and Zechariah. So go ahead and if you needed to use the white pages, table of contents to get to it, look it up and turn to it. But turn to Haggai with me. As we read the story of Haggai, and I'm not going to read the entire book to you, but we're going to cover the entire book. The book consists of 4 messages that God had given to the prophet Haggai, who gave to the people. Each one of these messages were given in a 4-month period, but each one of them are dated in relationship to the reign of Darius the king. So, as we look at this passage, as we look at these 4 messages that God has given to Haggai to give to the people, there are 4 truths that are true to us today too, especially in the area in which we live now, as we're coming out of a post-pandemic, post-quarantine, and coming back to our church. So let's look at the message together. The first message is a call to action we see in chapter 1. And the call to action is build the temple. The first message was given in the 2nd year of Darius the king on the 1st day of the 6th month. Now using our modern calendar, that would be August the 29th, 520 BC. Haggai brings this message, his first message, on the day of the festival of the new moon, when a great number of worshipers would be gathering together in Jerusalem. And the first thing I want you to see is the reproach. Their priorities were completely wrong. That's what verses 1 through 6 are talking about. Haggai's message is brief and to the point. But more importantly, because it is a message from God, it is both urgent and authoritative. Thus says the Lord of hosts. It's a reminder to the people that no matter the need, all of the resources of heaven are at God's command. Therefore, for the people, there can never be any cause for fear. There can be no reason to hesitate in obeying what God has called us to do. Thus says the Lord of hosts. No matter what it is that He tells us, when we know it's God telling us, All of God's commands are backed by His promises. Now, in this particular case, as these first 6 verses clearly show, God was very displeased with Israel and her spiritual apathy. Notice in verse 2, He refers to them as this people. He doesn't call them my people. These were the Jews. These were the God's chosen people. But because of their apathy, because of their indifference, because of their laziness, God said, this people. Their apathetic attitude is summed up in the statement, the time has not come, even the time for the house of the Lord to be rebuilt. They were allowed to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. And in 535 BC, they began building the temple. But 5 years later, they had given up on their hope. They had lost their vision. They had grown quite comfortable in not doing the Lord's work. I wonder in today's church if we're not guilty of exactly the same thing. Has God's people become comfortable in not doing the work of building His church? God's statement in verse 4 clearly points and unequivocally points to Israel's wrong sense of values. Their attitude was diametrically opposed to David, to that attitude of David. David felt at ease living in a luxurious and splendid housing while the Ark of the Covenant was housed in a tent. But verse 4 says these people were living in paneled houses, indicating a level of luxury far beyond the basic needs. Now, when you and I think about a paneled house, we're thinking about a small piece of veneer that we put over the drywall. But that's not at all what they're talking about here. They had gone up into the hills of Lebanon, brought back the cedars that were supposed to be going into the temple. But instead, they began to use it to line their own houses, living in luxury, and yet God's house was completely being neglected. So in verse 5, Haggai asked the people to give careful thought to the consequences of their misplaced priorities. The same admonition is given 5 times in this short chapter, in this short book, and is designed to shake people out of their complacency. By taking careful stock of their physical situation, they are led to realize how far they have strayed from the path of blessing. Verse 6 graphically draws attention to the realities of the situation. Though they had been reduced to abject poverty, not yet been reduced to abject poverty, the fruit of their labor falls way short of their expectation. On top of that, the food and clothing and money that they did have did not provide the benefits that they would normally expect. The people were bringing in less than expected, and what they did bring in didn't live up to their expectations. God's blessings simply are not there. Why? Because their priorities were wrong. They were putting self before God. And so the admonition of God through the prophet Haggai was to get your priorities right. Put God before self. That's what we see in verses 7 through 11. So as Haggai calls on the people to again consider their sin in neglecting the temple and the consequences of a lost blessing, he now begins to tell them what they must do. It's a simple matter of obeying God and starting once again to build the temple. By this one act of obedience, they will both please God and bring Him honor. Now, to make sure His hearers do not lose sight of this cause and effect relationship between their poverty and their neglect of the temple, Haggai reminds them of the fact that their harvests have been consistently much poorer than expected, and that what they do harvest doesn't last near as long as it should. The reason for this is simply that each one of them is so busy with their own house, with their own affairs, while the affairs of God and His house remains in ruins. That's what verse 9 is telling us. Because of their behavior, all of nature is affected. Not only the 3 main crops, but also the productivity of the people and the livestock. When God withheld the timely rain and the morning dew, and sent oppressive heat and drought, the people, the cattle, and the land all suffered. Since the temple lies in ruin, God called for drought and famine. Only as people put God first can they expect to experience His blessings. God hasn't changed. He operates the same way today. Only as we put God first will we ever experience His blessings. So, after Haggai pointed out their reproach, and after Haggai had given them the admonition, how did the people respond? And verses 12 through 15 record this response. The response was simply obedience and the will to restart building. Haggai's message is simple and to the point. The response of the people is likewise prompt and unequivocal. They fear the Lord because they recognize the voice of God in Haggai's words. And so they begin to work on the house of the Lord. God's gracious working provokes both fear, which is reverence, and obedience. As a result of their response, God can now promise renewed blessings. Look at what He says in verse 13. I am with you. Those words are repeated in chapter 2 and verses 4, along with other promises of blessing in chapter 5, verse 5 and 19 of chapter 2. All of those blessings, all of those promises constitute a powerful source of encouragement. When we respond in obedience, God is always going to remind us He is there with us. God's presence and His enablement guarantees the successful outcome of the project, no matter how severe the opposition, no matter how severe the various difficulties they encounter may be. I want you to notice one thing, though. As I said at the very beginning, Haggai began this first message on what would have been August the 29th, 520 BC. The people began to respond 24 days later. In 3 short weeks, on the 24th day of the 6th month, 21 September 520 BC, the work begins. So, Haggai's first message from God to the people is a call to action. Rebuild the house of God. The second message we find in chapter 2, in verses 1 through 9, and that is a word of encouragement. Again, it's dated in reference to the reign of Darius the king. It was given in the 2nd year of Darius the king on the 21st day of the 7th month, which in our modern calendar would be the 17th of October, 520 BC. Haggai brings this second message on the last day of the Feast of Booths. Usually, that's a joyful occasion because people are celebrating the harvest. But this year, because the harvest was so scanty, because the harvest was so minimized, it was hardly a joyful occasion. Why was the word of encouragement needed? Because the problem was the temple that was being built was inferior to Solomon's temple as before. Not quite a month after the work of the temple had begun, Haggai speaks to encourage the people, assuring them that their labor is not in vain, that what they are doing is indeed meaningful and pleasing to God. The problem is addressed in verse 3. Look at it with me. Who is left among you who saw this temple in its former glory? And now, do you see it? Does it not seem to you like nothing in comparison? Some of the people who had come back from the exile were present and knew and had seen firsthand Solomon's temple before it was destroyed over 50 years ago. Some of those people ridiculed and disparaged the new temple that was now under construction. Ezra 3, verses 10 through 13 recounts the laying of the foundation of the temple in 535 BC, shortly after the return of some exiles. Now there was great rejoicing over this laying of the foundation from the younger people who had never experienced Jerusalem or the Solomon's temple before they were taken into captivity. But for those old-timers who had seen the temple in all of its glory, there was loud weeping on their part. The priests, the Levites, the family heads were lamenting because they had seen the glory of Solomon's temple. And they knew that the present effort would never come close by comparison. Now, 15 years later, the people once again rebuild the temple. This negative attitude, though, still had a harmful impact on the people, making them wonder whether all of the effort might be in vain, since the temple would pale in comparison to Solomon's. Their temple seemed to be like nothing in comparison. We oftentimes are guilty of doing the same thing. We seem to bask today in the glory years of yesterday. Oh, I remember when. You remember when we had 200 people? Remember when we did this? Remember? Basking in the glory. And what seems to be happening today is always being held in comparison, and often, if we be honest, are always being held in an inferior light. The people needed encouraging. And so the encouragement came in verses 4 through 9 of chapter 2, saying a greater glory is yet to come. The phrase, take courage, or as in some translations, be strong, is repeated 3 times here. This is a recurring message from God when His appointed are facing a difficult or a crucial task. Take courage, be strong. God, all throughout the Bible, this is the message. God told Joshua to take courage when he was called to fill the shoes of Moses to take the promised land. He encouraged Solomon to build the original temple. When God has ordered a job to be done, He always does His part. And His admonition from God through Haggai is to take courage, be strong, and work. He grounds this affirmation on 2 promises. Verse 4, I am with you. Verse 7, I will fill this house with glory. The first promise is a link to the past, to the covenant made at Sinai, built on the covenant made with Abraham. God is not going to abandon His promises, nor His people. The second promise is linked to the future, the glory that is yet to come as promised again and again by the prophets. The fact that God is with His people means He approves of the work and that He will support and protect them. The fact that their activity is going to be used for His surpassing glory validates their work and lets them know that their work is not in vain. God makes these same 2 promises to us. Now here we are in 2020 as we come out of this pandemic, as we go into the post-quarantine church. Could God, almost 2,500 years ago, be giving us a message today? I am with you. Your work is not in vain. Everything that we do is not for the betterment of the church. It's for the glory of God. And that's what He's calling us to do. As He calls us to rebuild the church after all this quarantine, as He calls us to be His people and to take courage and to go to work, He reminds us, I am with you and I will fill this house with glory. To God's people, this makes all the difference. This is the difference between despair and rejoicing. This is the difference between defeat and victory. Now, it was only natural for the people to make comparisons between Solomon's temple and Zerubbabel's temple. But from God's perspective, these temples are both His house, singular. He didn't have 2 houses. He has 1 house. And today, the church is His house. I don't care how many thousands and upon thousands and thousands of churches there are, there's only 1 house of God, and that is His church. These buildings that are merely visible representations of the fact that God has seen fit to dwell amongst His people, whether in a tabernacle, whether in the temple of Solomon, or in the temple of Zerubbabel, or in the millennial temple that's going to be grander than all of them, that is still yet to come. The second temple, this second temple that's now under construction, it may not be as splendid as Solomon's, but nevertheless, it is still the house of God. We get into dangerous territory when we start comparing our church to somebody else's church. When we start complaining about our conditions and all things we don't have compared to what the other churches may or may not have. Since God has acknowledged that this is the house of God, and since He has promised His presence, there's absolutely no reason to be discouraged no matter what the circumstances is. And even so, He's saying that even Solomon's temple in all of its splendor, in all of its beauty, it will pale in comparison to the future temple that is coming. So, the people's job and the work that the people were doing in 520 BC as they began to rebuild this temple is all part of God's overall program of establishing His presence on earth, even though it may seem insignificant or inferior to the people at the time. This powerful principle is a great incentive to believers of today. As long as we are doing the work of God that He has given us, and we're doing it in accordance with His will, we are valued participants in God's great mission of making salvation known to a lost world. No matter how small our part may be, no matter how insignificant our part may seem in comparison to the roles of others, our obedience to the role God has given us is of great significance to God. Now I want you to look at this little expression in verse 6, in a little while. In a little while. That's an expression that's often used to describe the eschatological events. It emphasizes imminency and perhaps the suddenness at the onset of the events described. The future event that's described here in verses 6 and 7 reads this way: I'm going to shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land, and I will shake all of the nations, and I will fill this house with glory. Great upheavals, whether they be political, social, cosmic, or any other way, they're all in God's promise, God's program. All that is false, all that is impure, all that is in opposition to God will be removed in preparation for the establishment of His kingdom. And the whole world will be filled with His glory. And in this place, as verse 9 says, in this place I shall give peace. So Haggai has called the people to action. He's encouraged the people. Now in verse 3, he gives the third message, which is confirmation of the blessing. Haggai poses in two parts a legal question in verses 10 through 19 that the priests have absolutely no problem answering. He asks, if a priest carries a piece of consecrated meat in the folds of his robe, in other words, meat that is holy, meat that is clean, meat that has been presented and sanctified for the use in the temple, if that is being carried in the folds of his robe, would any food that comes in contact with that fold become ceremonially clean or holy? And of course, everybody knew the answer was no. On the other hand, would a defiled person, and he defines defiled person here as one who has touched a corpse, would a defiled person who is unclean render unclean or unholy anything he touches? And of course, everyone knew the answer was yes. Think of it in modern terms. You cannot catch good health from somebody by getting next to somebody that is healthy. But you can catch a virus from somebody that is sick. So health is not contagious, but disease may be. Well, Haggai then applies this lesson to the people of Judah. The uncleanness of Judah, which resulted from her disobedience in neglecting the temple for these past 10 years, has infected every area of life. Now, this third message, according to the text, was given in the second year of Darius the king on the 24th day of the 9th month. So using our modern calendar, this would be December the 18th, 520 BC. They are between harvests. The fields, the harvest that they from the previous crop has been gathered. They have not yet planted the seed for the next crop. The seed is still in the barn, and that's key to understanding what he's fixing to say. The previous harvest had been collected, but their silos, their vats, and their barns still showed the effects of their former disobedience. They have not yet experienced the abundant harvest that God has promised, even though they've been working on the new temple for 3 months now. But they are here. They realize that the last harvest only contained they only collected half of what they would normally expect. And the next harvest has not gone into the fields yet, while the seed is still in the barn. Haggai tells the people to mark this date. Write it down, December the 18th, as the beginning of a new era. Last half of verse 15 through verse 17 are great reminders of the past. The barns are still empty. The vine has not yet borne fruit, but from this day forward, they will begin to see the visible results of their obedience unfold in their very eyes. He said, write it down. From this day forward, from December the 18th, 520 BC, you will see the visible results of your obedience. Up to this point, they had begun to obey in faith. And verses 18 through 19 tell them God's blessing will become a tangible reality. God is saying the same thing to us today. No matter where we have been, no matter what we have done, no matter what we have experienced, today is the day to draw a line in the sand. On this day, on June 25th, 2020, draw a line in the sand. And from this day forward, if we will obey God with all that we do and all that He's called us to do, we will see the blessings of Him in a very tangible way. It does not matter how you performed in the past. It does not matter where you failed. It does not matter where you turned aside. Draw a line in the sand. And this day, while the seed is in the barn, I will pour out my blessings. That is a great promise from God. And His promises have not changed. And then finally, the fourth message that He gives, we see recorded in verses 20 through 23. This fourth and final message of Haggai is given on the exact same day as the last one, but it's directed specifically to Zerubbabel. It is the fourth message is about the restoration of David's kingdom. Now, the events that are scribed here are clearly eschatological. The phrase, I am going to shake the heavens and earth in verse 21 is the same as in verse 6 and 7. It refers to the great upheaval and will precede the establishments of God's kingdom. He said He would overthrow the thrones of kingdoms in verse 22. He's using the same Hebrew word used out in describing the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah back in Genesis. God is not talking about reformation here. He is speaking of complete destruction. That is the fate of this world and everything that this world has to offer. That's the fate of world powers. The overthrowing of the chariots and their drivers is reminiscent of the destruction of Pharaoh's army as they crossed through the dry land of the sea and the sea collapsed on them. The confusion will be so great that men will die by sword of their own brothers. Just when the powers of the world seem to be unassailable, just when we think that it can't get any worse, God will shake them, God will overthrow them, and God will destroy them. Then He will establish His kingdom. Well, let me ask you a question about this text. Why was this last message directed specifically to Zerubbabel? Well, the truth of the matter is, Zerubbabel was in the royal line. He was the grandson of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah. Jehoiakim was the king of Judah when Judah was taken into exile by the Babylonians. And after the Babylonian exile, Darius I appointed him as governor of the province of Judah. But he never reigned as king. Nor were there any aspirations on Haggai's part to make him a king. He was not the king because Israel was considered at this point to be a province of Babylon. But Haggai is using Zerubbabel, the current representation of David's royal line, to point to the Messiah. God's Messiah will successfully accomplish the task for which He has sent. In verse 23, the term signet ring refers to the authority that's given to the king. And in this particular case, it's referring to the authority that's given to the king we know as Jesus, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He will be God's personal representative. The designation is one of high honor and privilege. Now, it is noteworthy that the curse on Zerubbabel's grandfather, Jehoiakim, is couched in language involving the signet ring. And though he was the signet ring on God's right hand, Jehoiakim was pulled off and cast to his enemies, the Babylonians. But now God is promising that the Davidic line, in the person of the Messiah, it will be restored to the place of authority and honor, God's signet ring. He is still Lord of Lords. He is still King of Kings. He is the only one, the name above all other names. And He has been exalted so that at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And so the book ends on a note of encouragement. The labor of Zerubbabel is not in vain. There will be an immediate blessing, but there will also be future glory in a temple of surpassing splendor and a king who rules on this earth for 1,000 years as God's personal representative on earth. There was every reason for Judah to be encouraged, just as there's every reason for believers today to be encouraged in obeying and serving God. It does not matter who you are, what church you belong to. It does not matter if we're a small church, big church. It does not matter whether we're a rich church or poor church. It does not matter whether we're a country church or a city church. The only thing that matters is, are we God's church? I don't want to be part of a good church. I want to be part of a great church. God gave us a great commission. God gave us a great commandment. And the greatest of all is love. From this day forward, as we come out of this quarantine period, as we begin to return to churches, and for those of you who are watching, maybe your church is already back in in-person services. Maybe it hasn't come back yet. But we're all coming to a new church. What is God trying to tell us? What God was trying to say in 520 BC, He's saying to us today, I am with you. I will fill my house with glory. And from this day forward, while the seed is still in the barn, I will bless you. Friends, let me encourage you. Be obedient to God. As an individual, as a family, as His church, be obedient to God, and let's together rebuild His house.